welcome Richard.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us.
It's my pleasure. I'm here to help interpret the evangelicals, talk about climate change, where we're going from here, what the current history of this movement is relative to these issues that are so important, both here and abroad, and then lastly sum it up with some observations about what can be done about it. One of my favorite stories is, because I am in the business of interpreting, is the story of the evangelical who's riding in his Jeep, and he sees on the hillside along the road a sheep herder with his sheep. He slams on his brakes, he walks up to the sheep herder and he says, "Sir," he says, "if I can tell you how many sheep you have, can I have one?" This sheep herder is just dumbstruck by the question, and he says, "Yes, of course." American Evangelical goes back into his truck, gets on its GPS, we'll just call that God's positioning satellite for the moment, and he comes back with an answer. And he goes to the man and he says, "Sir, you have 1,258 sheep. And the man says, "That's totally amazing. Go pick one out." Well, the American picked one out, and he puts it in his truck and is driving away when the man runs up to the window, knocks on it, and he says, "Sir," he says, "if I can tell you what you do for a living, can I have my sheep back?" And the American says, "Well, of course, certainly," knowing full well the man would never know that. And he says, this man who's tended his sheep most of his life, he says, "Sir, you are a consultant." And the American says, with amazement, he says, "How did you know?" And he says, that is the sheep herder says, he says, "First of all, you come into my world, you don't know anything about it, you give me answers that I don't need, leave out, charge me a lot of money," and he says, most importantly, he says, "You don't know diddly squat, you took my sheepdog." So interpreting the evangelicals is difficult. My story, and I'll weave it a little bit into what I'm going to say in these next 20 minutes or so, because we want to cover a lot of territory. But essentially, I really care about Asia. And I did as a young man growing up because I was given Pearl Buck's book, The Good Earth, which you may or may not have read. In any case, I went to college, studied Mandarin, came to graduate school here at the Elliott School, graduated, and then went overseas because I was one of the first students, American students, sponsored by Rotary International Graduate Fellowships to go to the Republic of China in those days, because in 1974 and 1975, you couldn't get into the mainland if you were an American. And so I traveled through Asia. The Vietnam War was in its waning days, up through Manila to Singapore. I think we've got somebody here from Singapore.
Yes.
There you do, sir. Singapore, then up to Thailand, through Malaysia to Thailand to Hong Kong. Couldn't get into Cambodia and Vietnam for obvious reasons, but then on to Taiwan, where I spent the next year studying, and then on the way back went through Korea and the rest, and came back to the United States. While I was in Taiwan, I had perchance to meet two men, icons for American religion in the 20th century. One a Protestant, namely Norman Vincent Peale, and the other was Billy Graham, the evangelist. And both of them influenced my life in ways which are revealed even to this day. One, when I was a college student, I was converted to Christ. When I went to graduate school, I thought, well, I'm going to go into the Foreign Service. That's why I went to Taiwan. That's why I studied Mandarin. I was going to go there, and I met Norman Vincent Peale, who you may know from history books, had written such famous books because he was a world traveler, like How to Win Friends and Influence People, if you've heard of that. This was Norman Vincent Peale, and we're both on the program. I'm having to give my presentation at a combined Rotary Club for 300 business leaders in Mandarin. He got to speak in English, but while seated there, he said to me, "Young man, what are you going to do with your life?" And I said, "Sir, I'm really reevaluating. I thought I was going to go into the Foreign Service. After all, I'd been here in GW for grad school and was going to apply for the Foreign Service." And he said, "Well, aren't you?" And I said, "No, I'm going to go back to the United States and go to seminary." And he said, "Well, God can use a few good diplomats." So I came back, went to seminary, and came to Washington to work for the National Association of Evangelicals, which leads me to answer this question, which hopefully I will do better than some others. having worked for the National Association of Evangelicals in my life for 28 years. Most of my career was working for the NAE here in Washington after seminary. And so who are these people? And it's a little difficult because the word itself is problematic. Evangelical comes from the Greek word meaning evangelion, or good news, and is usually described politically. The 84% that voted for Donald Trump. That's how people understand evangelicals today, largely politically. On the other hand, academics, professionals, and others look at the term and they say, oh, ambiguous. It is filled with fluidity and imprecision and can't meaningfully designate any group of Christians in this country. Who are these evangelicals? And so I would suggest to you that despite these reservations, including the fact you see that having had slavery in this country, followed by cultural isolation and oppression, blacks don't identify with white evangelicals in any way meaningfully at all, except maybe by articles of faith. And what are those? And a historian by the name of Bebinger, he describes these evangelicals four ways. Theologically, he says, one, they believe in conversionism, that your life needs to be changed. He says they are biblicists, who believe that the Bible contains in it all sorts of spiritual truth. Two, so there's conversionism, biblicism. And third, there is this aspect of activism or service to God for one's faithfulness to Him, out of one's faithfulness to God. And then not least of all, there is a crucicentrism, which is to say the belief that Christ's death on the cross provides the atonement for sin to satisfy God's judgment. And so you have these four factors, all that are representative of this community of evangelicals that today in the United States represents anywhere from 70 to 100 million people. That doesn't mean 100 million voters, it means 100 million people, but easily 60 to 70 million voters. And if you look at those 60 to 70 million, 84% of them voted for Donald Trump. And that poses real challenges. So Nancy and other friends of mine, we've created Evangelicals for Democracy, which will relate to climate change, and I'll indicate in a few moments why. But these are these views that have characterized evangelicals, albeit divided by faith. That's the name of Emerson and David Smith's book, Divided by Faith. But divided by faith, nonetheless, they still represent, in general, theologically, what these people believe, these evangelicals. Now, don't mistake for the European definition, which is simply Protestant. They say, oh, the evangelicals are the Protestants. Well, no. In this country, Protestantism has historically referred to the National Council of Churches and evangelicalism by the National Association of Evangelicals. Two major groupings. Both are significant in size, but clearly, when I came to work for the NAE at the height of, at the sort of the apex of the creation of the new religious right in 1979, I began a journey, which I can tell you a little bit in the course of explaining what I want to say. But how did we get to this place? I mean, look at the statistics. I looked them up, and I don't know how many of you got this from PRRI or from Pew or whatever. But if you look at the statistics, the evangelicals say, because they are biblicists, they say, oh, by 64%, we have a sacred view of the earth. 86% say that God gives us a duty to care for it. In the 70s, 75% says Scripture gives us a mandate and a lessons for doing that. And then not least of all, they say 43% even say they pray for the earth. Now, how does that square with the fact that if you look at what framing is done by Pew and others, they say this framing of the evangelicals in climate looks as follows. One, it's their views, which on the one hand attest to the need to serve God, to care for the earth, to even pray for it, and the rest. So you've got all that on the one side, the good ledger. The bad side is the fact that, well, only 8%, according to Pew, of the most religious, most highly religious people in America are concerned. Only 8% are even concerned about climate change. We know that these other numbers are reflected as well. In other words, a complete disputation of our human responsibility by 60 to 40%. In other words, around 40% of evangelicals say we have a responsibility here to believe and act on human cause, climate change. Only 39% say we even have a responsibility to do that or even believe that it exists. So on the one hand, you have this attestation, and then on the other side, by way of action, a disputation. It's not unlike all Americans, because if you look at the 6 Americas that are put out by Anthony Lazarowitz at the Yale School, he says in the 6 Americas, even the most disturbed, even those who are most concerned about climate change, he says of that 13% of the total American population that's deeply concerned about this, only 3% have ever engaged with their politicians on the subject. So this is the current state. And among evangelicals, wow, you see some shift, but nevertheless, they're characterized by these following findings, these evangelicals. And it's deeply important to understand who these people are and what they believe. And they believe, one, the views I've expressed by virtue of their number one factor, guess? Anyone want to speculate? What's the number one factor that determines evangelical views on climate change? Political party, the Republican Party. What's the second? Oh, we have bigger problems to address. Much other problems that we have to address in this country. Number 3, God is in control. That's number 3. God's in control. We don't have to worry about this. Number 4, climate is actually not changing. That's the 4th finding. And not least of all, this one I already mentioned, which is that only in 8% of churches do the congregants and the pastor or priest, in only 8% is there even any discussion of climate change. So this is the current reality, and it poses huge problems for taking action. Okay. I came to Washington in 1979. The moral majority was just being created. Like I said, I had become a Christian a few years earlier, in 1972. By the way, the movement that led me to that Christian faith is now reflected in a major movie called The Jesus Revolution. And it was the day in which long-haired hippies started to follow Christ. And I was a young man at that time in 1972, but I was a bit of an anomaly in one respect. I had my hair a lot longer. I was a political liberal, working for RFK and then in the presidential campaign for George McGovern, who only won one state. And yet, on the other hand, despite those liberal views of opposing the war, I also was a member of ROTC. So on Saturdays, I marched with a rifle, an M1 in those days, at Gonzaga University. So I've always been this individual who tried to balance both. What is my obligation to my country? What is my obligation to God? And this is really the history of evangelicals. And so my 3rd point on this is, who are these people? What do they believe? Number 3 is, how do we get to this place? And I think you have to understand an historical point. And I'll try and not belabor this too much, but my favorite historian on the topic is Marcia Pally. And she wrote a book on the new evangelicals. And she says that our forebears understood society as a covenant. These evangelicals understood it as a covenant between persons and God. And that should a ruler breach that covenant, the people, the sovereign people, have a right to throw him out or her out. And so covenantalists, as they were described, believe in one, a wariness of government and authorities, born out of Western Europe, state churches and state societies. That was their caution, government authorities and of outsiders that would disturb their lives. And so probably the number one doctrine which is carried forward all the way through American history, she writes as a historian, is this idea that one, we are citizens, but government itself is not the kingdom of God, is fallen, and we have to be wary of it and wary of outsiders. And our duty is to work out our witness to God's vision, emphasizing individual responsibility, moral reckoning, and lastly, awareness of outsiders. So get that picture. Wow, look at those three. And then a key additional doctrine that evangelicals believe in, unlike Catholics, namely that each person's agency in salvation is up to them, not to a priest or to priestly authority. And this is what has led historically, if you know American history, to anti-authoritarianism, localist anti-federalism. It was part of the Jeffersonian-Jacksonian debates of the 18th century, with clergy becoming central figures in agrarian anti-landlord protests. So there is this twofold doctrine, she says, you see all through American history, and if you wind it up, and you look at what's happened in the last 20 years in America, you see that mentality held by the Tea Party advocates, the forerunners of today's Trumpers, and it's all led to a kind of toxic group. In other words, what is that? A belief that science and evolution, including even scientists like Dr. Fauci, the head of President's AIDS task force, HIV/AIDS first, years and years ago, and now
Then
on
COVID.
right? So Fauci, here he is, doing great work, and he's become the target of hate mail and death threats, because of this latent holding on science, evolution, and creation, and adherence, secondly, to kind of a small government view, and opposition to the kind of regulations that will come from climate change, and more recently, even you see anti-immigration views, strongly held, build the wall, etc., and all part of what is a kind of mentality that goes back all the way to the early part of the country, in which covenantalists who were interested in protecting their socio-cultural and religious life feared outsiders and put the blame on them. So that's where we are today. And the real question is, given that background and where we're at, what do we do about this? Big question. And if you look at this community of 45 million white evangelicals and Hispanics, you find that more than half embrace Christian nationalism, and a significant percentage equally disbelieve in anthropogenic human climate change. And so I would make a case today that the Trump revolt, the revolution by Trumpists against government, against outsiders, against climate, against much of what I believe as a new evangelical, is very much related to what is also going on in this country called Christian nationalism. And that's why we created evangelicalsfordemocracy.org. And if you look at both movements, and I've never said this before publicly, but if you look at the two movements, what do you see? Politically conservative, a belief in the Bible as authoritative, eschatological end times prophecy. See a lot of that in Christian nationalism. Apocalyptic visions of economic decline, distrust of mainstream science and the like, and also you see a part of this idea that it's all part of God's plan. And yet, as a new evangelical, I can say to you, that is not what I believe. And I'm doing everything I can through this movement called New Evangelicals to change that. And it should give us hope. And how does this work? We put up ads in the last um, 2020 election and 2022. In 2020, we targeted those 45 million white and Hispanic evangelicals with digital ads, YouTube presentations, TikTok, and all the rest, and contacted over 40 million of these evangelicals, 4 million of whom responded in one way or another to our messages by email, and approximately 80,000 visited our website, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands went to our ads. Typical ad on Christian nationalism in Spanish, asked in 30 seconds or less, was Judas Iscariot, if you know your Bible, the first Christian nationalist, and Hispanics went there in droves. I used to watch it right before the election, and as I watched the YouTube numbers go up, they would go up 1,000, tens of thousands sometimes by the hour, up to over 700,000 views on that one alone. And so there's a huge market out there for understanding these views on Christian nationalism. And we think we're making a difference by pushing people as follows. A friend of mine, by the way, who's Buddhist, his name is Bob Doppel, University of Oregon. Years and years wrote a book called The Power of Sustainable Thinking. I don't know if you've ever heard of the book. Bob's well, you know, a great guy, and he authored what he called in those days the 5 Ds, and he's given me permission to use it vis-a-vis not just climate, but on democracy. And what are those 5 Ds? It's moving people through our digital ads, through our emails, through our presentations, here and even abroad, as follows. Moving people from deny, I won't change. By the way, 80% of Americans say I'm not going to change. And when it comes to their worldviews, most do not change. In fact, it takes, according to Bob Doppel, he says it takes benefits that outweigh the liabilities by 2 to 1 to get somebody to change their mind. But a lot of Americans are in the deny, I won't. Moving them to deliberate, that's the second one. I might change. Whoa, get somebody to say they might change and you almost have them. Third, I won't, I might, I will. That's called design. I will change. The following D is I'm doing it. I have changed, I'm doing it, and lastly, I'm defending it. So I won't, I might, I will, I am, and I have. Those are the 5 Ds. Not just on climate, in my opinion, but you see, also on changing views on Christian nationalism. And we think we're making a big difference in both regards. And using this model, we urge people, and have done, to take a pledge. To take a pledge that effectively rules out the possibility of voting. In my mind, by taking the pledge, you can go to the website, check it out, evangelicalsfordemocracy.org. We call it E4D, but anyway, a pledge, and that is to not vote for any candidate or policy that denies democracy. And I would also say that denies the science of climate change, because the two are very closely related. And what was the result in the last election? We found that we were significantly able, for example, in 2020, to get 350,000 voters in Georgia and Michigan to shift from having voted for Trump to voting for Biden. And in the last election, the midterms, we were able to show that significantly the numbers of people who would have voted for the anti-democracy candidates, the numbers who were going to vote for them declined. And so we think we're making a difference. And so my final quote, which has which has been something I've thought about for many, many years, comes from a man who wrote a book called American Theocracy. The Peril and Politics of Radical Religion, Oil, and Borrowed Money came out in the 21st century. It came out in New York by Viking in 2006. The author is Kevin Phillips, and here's what Phillips says. Few questions will be more important in the 21st century United States than whether nascent, renascent religion and its accompanying political hubris will be carried on the nation's books as an asset or a liability. In other words, and he's talking about the evangelicals. And if you look at the book, you have to say, wow, what have we as evangelicals bought into? And by the way, I'm in Tibet. I've done many government trips overseas, once for Bill Clinton to China on religious freedom issues, and we were in Tibet, and we're meeting with a monk. And I say, sir, I said, up on your TV screen is reporting by CNN about earthquakes in the state of Oklahoma. And he says, I know. And I said, well, what does that mean to you? Well, as a Buddhist monk, he says, the earth cannot be understood unrelated to what's happening to human beings. So I say, well, what is that, sir? And he says, well, do you know how many oil wells there are in Oklahoma? And I said, well, I once read Kevin Phillips' book. Have you ever heard of it? He said, no. And Phillips writes that in Oklahoma in the 1920s and 30s, they began drilling for oil. And there were over 50,000 holes in the 20s and 30s alone in Oklahoma. And so he says, the monk says, is it any surprise you have earthquakes, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, on and on, all through Oklahoma? All you have to do is ask Oklahomans about, and they'll tell you about the earthquakes, minor earthquakes that occur all the time. Well, anyway, the point of it is to say that you cannot have a vision for caring for this earth that's born of a religious view that doesn't acknowledge that we as human beings, in our spirits, in our souls, are related to this earth. And if we are unwell, and believe me, all you have to do is look at even at the evangelical figures on climate change to know people are unwell. Because if you deny something that is factually true, at some point or another you're going to have to repent. And we heard it last night on the television about an Arizona lawyer for Trump, Jeannie Ellis, who came forward and said it was all a lie, the Trump claim about a stolen election. And she says, I was wrong, I lied, I'd rather not lose my law license. That's what led her probably. What most people don't know and isn't reported on is that she's an evangelical Christian who got caught up in Trumpism and has decided, for fear of losing her law license, that she's going to speak the truth. And she said it's all a lie, what we did. And so the question is, how many more people can we get by making that shift to believe this? And so my calling in closing is to say what Wesley wrote. He said, to serve the present generation, my calling to fulfill, all my powers engaged to do my master's will, arm me with jealous care, as in thy sight to live, and all thy servantly prepare a strict account to give. And so I challenge people. There's an account to give. And Bob Doppelt says, Richard, you need 10,000 more people who, like you, will be disturbers. Like you were a disturber at my association, where they finally threw me out because of what I said. But that's all right. I'm doing much better off anyway. But the evangelicals, by virtue of their numbers and their beliefs, are hugely important to the fate of the planet, in closing. And so thanks for listening. That's my I had to check in.
That's brilliant, Richard. And what Richard is doing is no small thing. This is groundbreaking. this is opening up a conversation when a narrative, a very narrowly controlled narrative, has been having a major impact on the US climate denialism and dragging their feet on global climate commitments and responsibility taking. So this is really huge, and that shifting and the changing of minds and bringing people into consciousness it has the potential to have major global effects.
And people can change like that.
Yeah.
When in the case of Jeannie Ellis, well, okay, it's true. Self-interest finally won out over her lies, but she knew inside she was lying, right?
Yeah.
She knew she was lying. People know, even Tucker Carlson and all the rest of the Fox News hosts, we now discovered they all knew it was a lie. Mm-hmm. And you know what? All those people that worked for, ExxonMobil and Chevron and Shell and all of them that for so long have fought the climate science, they know for a fact they've been lying too.
Could you talk a little bit about the motivation? We have there's a history of evangelical Christianity that was about inclusion, about coming from poverty and illiteracy and opening doorways to now this motivation of this dominating narrative behind the climate denialism. Could you talk about that a little bit, please?
If I understand the question,
you hit upon it with Exxon.
well, people have been lying. Major corporations have been lying. By the way, it's pretty simple to lie to a lot of Americans because we know at the same time that 3% say, I've only a small percent, 3% have ever talked to their elected official about, climate change. But 100% of them buy and know who they're buying from and what the source of the product is they're buying. So what does that say to you? Well, it's well understood that Americans view themselves more as consumers than as citizens. But the lying is starting to abate somewhat. I posted on Facebook the CNN interview on Sunday morning with the president of Chevron, who admits that we've got to change. And let's be fair to the conservatives. I will add this, and I made a note to myself to say this lest I forget, so I'll just read what I wrote to myself. And it's a bit of an optimistic note too. It goes like follows. Conservatives aren't really for fossil fuels. And conversely, they are for renewable energy. It's just that they don't believe that we have the capacity, technologically, economically, to pivot as quickly as we need to get off fossil fuels. But what these conservatives do say, and I've met with and talked to many, many of them, some are my best friends of this, they get that fossil fuels are harming our health, their health. And one of my friends is an old oil geologist who lives in Elkins, West Virginia, and he says, oh, well, we can't really do much about it. He's in the evangelical denialist mode that says, God's in control, and we can't do anything about it anyway. We can't shift fast enough. He's in that crowd. And I say, well, of course we can shift. But he will admit, as a conservative, oil geologist, supporter of the oil companies, that fossil fuels are damaging human health. And on that basis, there is an appeal that works as well, even not just for the Gen Z evangelicals, but for the old line, over 50 crowd like me. I don't know if that's an answer, but that's just
it's
a comment.
Getting to, yeah.
Look, why are Americans so gullible? Why are Americans so stupid to allow themselves to be hoodwinked by oil company executives that are just lying through their teeth. It behooves me to say that in part it's because we've lost, and I'll take this not from a scientific or a business or any other point, I'll take this from a religious perspective. Namely, that we have lost a religious vision for the sanctity of the earth and nature. And the conservatives, they talk all about the sanctity of human life in their pro-life-ism, with no regard whatsoever, apparently, for what was historically taught, not just by the prophets of the Old Testament, but by Jesus himself, that you can't drown your neighbor and say you love him. You can't do that. It doesn't work. It's a lie if you believe that. And so here we are, and there is going to be one hell of a moral reckoning, pardon my French, but it is a coming. And the sad reality of it is, because we know already the impacts, look at California this week, is that millions and billions of people will die as a result. Well, I don't want that. I just don't want that on my conscience. By the way, can I tell one story I've never told? I got a minute.
Yeah.
I'm being interviewed by Christian Amanpour over on East Potomac Park. And we finish up, and it was for what became an Emmy Awards series on CNN called God's Warriors. And one of them was on climate and my activism and some others. And there were other segments on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, etc. But it was about God's warriors. And we're finishing up, and she says, "Oh, Richard, I gotta go." I said, "Where are you going?" She says, "I'm going to Lynchburg, Virginia." I said, "Why are you going there?" She says, "I'm going to meet Jerry Falwell." I says, "Oh, you're kidding me." The founder of the religious right in the 1970s. Southern racist who, finally decides as a fundamentalist he's going to get involved in politics. That's because of, the IRS's decision to take away tax income status for the, white sectarian schools. So he decides to get in politics, but then Paul Weyrich, who I worked with and knew for many, many years on Capitol Hill, Weyrich says, "Well, we'll get these evangelicals, these fundamentalists involved, because we'll use the quote pro-life issue." So she says she's going to meet the famed preacher from Lynchburg, and I said, "Well, you better go fast." And she says, "Why?" I says, "Nobody knows this, but I know this. I've met Jerry. I walked out of the 9/11 ceremony at the Washington Cathedral with him. Jerry has congestive heart failure." She said, "I didn't know that." I said, "He does." And I says, "You better get there, but I have one request. Try and get him to say, for the sake of my two boys, on camera, that those people who don't believe in climate change include the likes of that guy Cizik, And all he said in an interview with her was, the only people who believe in climate change are those blue-helmeted UN types, liberals like George Soros. I was an Open Society fellow. Thank you, George Soros. And misinformed evangelicals. That was all he was willing to say on camera. And we didn't have to wait for the full release of the interview on CNN's special, God's Warriors, a number of months later, because I flew to Seattle to give a speech, and I was opening up my phone as I got off the plane at SeaTac Airport, and the message is, call us, BBC. Call the number, and they say, Falwell dead. And I just stood there. Couldn't believe it. It was 10 days later. 10 days later. And what I saw was the interview that he gave Reverend Falwell, Dr. Jerry Falwell, gave Christian Amanpour. He had a heart attack a week later on a Monday when everybody gets off from church because, church staff, because Sunday's been a big day at Thomas Road Baptist Church in Lynchburg, Virginia, and he was there by himself in the office and had a heart attack and died 11 days later. And she got the last public interview with him, but we don't know. None of us knows how long we'll be on this earth.
No.
And Jerry said, I told the Lord, he said, He said, I told the Lord that I needed 20 more years, like Hezekiah, to, for Liberty University. Hezekiah told the Lord, and he got 18 years, but Jerry got 10 days. And I don't say that with any, ill will. And in so many ways, I love the man in spite of himself. But what a story! I mean, it's a certain story of moral reckoning. And I'm not belittling him to say God probably. I hope you don't take it this way, but God may have just said, Jerry, you've done enough damage. Because we have to take his word seriously. And if it says, care for the earth, then don't burn it. I mean, seriously. So I gotta wrap up here a bit.
That's a bit fast, but we have space for questions, and you can go a little bit longer if you want to have also some coffee and some
Sure.
informal space if
Yeah.
you have the time.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Any questions? Glenda, and please introduce yourself.
So I'm familiar with Billy Graham really well, actually, through my father. So in terms of the evangelical space, do you think, though, there's almost a disconnect between the religious belief and political or social beliefs? Because it seems like the Tea Party and Trumpism is almost separate, and they call themselves the religious right, but they're almost reflecting a specific Christian, point of view that's nationalist but uses religion as an excuse for that.
If what you're saying is there a disconnect here, and are these people really religious?
That's what I mean.
Yeah. Answer, no. But what has happened, though, when religion, for example, evangelical religion, when I came to work for the association in 1980, it represented, evangelicals represented close to 25% of American people, 25%. And what is it today? It's down to 16%. So there's been it's called, if there was once a great awakening, there is now the great dissatisfaction and departure. There is a great, huge departure, because these voices that claim to speak for these evangelicals out there really don't, many times. And so it gives evangelicals a bad name when they really don't, and have no real connection whatsoever with genuine evangelical faith. Because if you look back at American history, the preachers were the black robes of the Revolutionary War, preaching in their pulpit, revolution. They were the advocates for suffrage, not just abolition, but also for suffrage. And so the history of the progressive evangelicals is very, very clear. But there has been a co-opting of so many people who don't know any better. And of course there is this great divide, and I'm more comfortable in black churches than I am in most white churches. But maybe that's because I'm a bit of a rebel, Did I answer your question? Yeah, see, I think there is a sense in which these conservatives, the Trumpers, are actually going now to evangelical churches because they think they're one of them, when they really haven't ever made a conversion decision. They've never made that path, taken that path. And so it gets all muddied up. And hopefully the new evangelicals will reclaim our true heritage and become the mainstream. Because see, one author I would quote, and I'm not sure quite how to pronounce her name, but it's Monique L. Faizy, F-A-I-Z-Y, God and Country, How Evangelicals Have Become America's New Mainstream. She says, Bloomsbury Press, 2006. She's talking about economics, our use of power, our nationalism, our methodology, our politics, and otherwise. It's adapting the trappings of mainstream and now resembling secular America, the evangelicals, the white evangelicals at least. And so faith has turned out to be a potent tool, you know, for mobilizing people for political alliances, but not a very good movement for, you know, reclaiming and creating the beloved community that we all hope and pray for, that we treat other people with respect and love one another.